Okay, I'm trying to be helpful for you in telling the stories Jesus told, telling stories about the teachings of Jesus, telling stories about the life of Jesus, how he actually lived, how he did things, and then telling stories of what Jesus has done in your life or somebody else's life so that we can be more effective in sharing our faith with our friends. And so one of the things I think we've done in the Western world is we've taken particularly the teachings of Jesus and we've made them simply into theological or doctrinal points, but we do that even with his parables. I've also given a little teaching like this one I'm doing here on retelling the stories Jesus told. This one is going to focus on just retelling the teachings of Jesus in story form. So rather than making them 4-point sermons, if you're a preacher, or turning his teachings into doctrinal discourses, as I think we're tempted to do, especially here in the West. That's how we're tempted to talk about that. What I want to do is talk about the teachings of Jesus in story form. Is it possible to tell his teachings in almost parabolic form? And I think it is. So some interesting facts or interesting points in how Jesus teaches. First of all, have you ever noticed that he teaches both his disciples, like the 12 or maybe the 70 or 120, whoever the ones that were closest to him, he teaches them at the same time as he teaches the crowds. So in this thing that we call the Sermon on the Mount, or I call it the talk on the side of a hill, he withdraws with his 12 disciples. He actually calls the disciples to himself, but by the end of Matthew chapter 7, it says, and the crowds were amazed at his teachings. What were the crowds doing there? Because you think about those 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7, what we call the Sermon on the Mount. It's pretty deep stuff, and you imagine him talking to his 12 guys that are just sitting around him, but there were crowds there. So somehow Jesus had the ability to talk and teach to both the crowds, kind of the distant followers, and his inner circle of followers at the same time. I find that really interesting. Secondly, he was able to talk about deep things, like really deep theological points, and at the same time say the most simple, even almost sounding simple-minded. I mean, just don't shoo the children away. Let the little kids come to me. And so then we make a big point out of that. I'm thinking Jesus just liked kids, And so, but then he turns around and he talks about eating my flesh and drinking my blood, and then all the disciples freak out, and it says many of them left, and then he turns to Peter and says, do you guys want to go too? And then Peter says, no, where will we go to find the words of life? And so Jesus has this interesting mix of the inner circle with the big crowds, deep teaching with simple teaching at the same time. And then finally, I think this is interesting about his teachings, he doesn't always explain himself. So like that time in John chapter 6 where Jesus takes this really deep teaching of eating my flesh and drinking my blood, which is hard to figure out. I think even now in hindsight, we kind of have an idea what he might have meant. He didn't explain himself. And if you notice, even when he's asked questions, direct questions, often theological questions that were trying to trick him, to be fair, but questions, he wouldn't answer them. And I think even sometimes he was asked real questions and he didn't answer. I think those are 3 points that you have to kind of wrestle with when you think of the teachings of Jesus. Why is it that way? Why did he teach both the crowds and his disciples? Why does he never answer questions? Why does he say sometimes things that are so deep and profound that we can't figure out till now? And other times he talks very simply. I'm not going to give you the answers today, trying to be like Jesus, but you should wrestle with those issues. Now, okay, here's a thought. Work on transitional statements. So you're with your friend, you're talking about life, whatever. They say something really, something about being tired or exhausted, or they're feeling frustrated or angry or whatever. Learn to say, that's interesting because that reminds me of, and then it has to remind you of something. So if it doesn't remind you of something that Jesus said, then don't do that. Or tricky. You think that's a tricky thing that your friend tried to do to you. Speaking of tricky, that actually reminds me of Jesus. You don't think of tricky and Jesus in the same sentence usually, but Jesus was pretty tricky. Because what's funny about Jesus is that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious people of his day, you know how religious people are. And you're saying to your friend, you know how those religious people are. They're always trying to trick Jesus. Isn't that funny? Think about that, they're getting together and having a little council on tricking Jesus. But what happens, of course, is Jesus always tricks them. He comes back with a question that they weren't expecting. It's fun to watch. It's so interesting. So here's some simple thoughts that you might want to find, that you might find simple, easy, interesting to share with your friends based on Jesus' teachings. Tiredness. You ever been tired? Anybody that you know ever been tired? Of course. So somebody's telling you how tired they are. That's a great opportunity just to say, that reminds me of something Jesus said about being tired. I don't know how this works. I have no idea. It's like magic or something. But Jesus actually said, if you come to him, I don't know what that means today because he's not physically with us. Back then he was actually physically with them. But he said, if you come to me, I'll give you rest. No, you can believe that or not believe that. I don't know. I don't know how it's true. But I find, interestingly enough, I find that when I do that in some kind of mystical sense, when I come to Jesus, I don't know if it's prayer or if it's just slowing down a little bit and saying, hi, Jesus, I'm a little tired today. Any chance we can kind of do that rest thing? That it works. He does it. He gives you rest. So you can say that to your friends and say it that way, just real natural, real casual. Anytime your friend is confused about religion or theology or maybe they're asking you a question about the Bible or you Christians think this or that or, I don't take that label upon myself, Christian, because I think it's not very helpful and it doesn't make much sense in these days. I call myself a follower of Jesus, as many of you would know. But let's say they want to talk religion with you or theology or they want to argue something. It's a perfect time to say, it's interesting that you bring that up because Jesus summarized the whole deal in one sentence. Do you know that? He summarized the whole thing. At that time, there was this thing called the Torah, what we now call the Old Testament, the books of Moses and kind of the Jewish Bible, you could say it that way. He summarized the whole thing. He said, here's all the law and all the prophets in one statement. Love God and love people. That's pretty good. So what if we just did that? Now, it's not that easy, we find to love God and love people because some people are a little obnoxious. Not us, of course, but others. But if you'll just love God and love people, that summarizes everything. I mean, isn't that amazing? I mean, isn't that incredible? Another great one to talk to anybody about, but especially people who are a little skeptical, is some of the verses from the Sermon on the Mount or the talk on the side of the hill, like do not judge. Because what is it people that are on the outside of the church feel all the time the church is doing to them, whether it's true or not, and oftentimes it is, unfortunately, they feel judged by the church. I always just say, listen, the church has not been a good representation of Jesus the last 2,000 years, fair enough. Jesus said, do not judge. Now, I don't always follow that because sometimes I judge, but he doesn't. He's really merciful. Maybe then you want to go back and tell a story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, about how he didn't judge her, how he didn't condemn her. Also, the log in the eye. I love that one. Boy, you think you've got problems. I mean, I've got a log in my eye. I mean, imagine that. I mean, Jesus says, don't worry about the speck in your brother's eye or your friend's eye. Get the log out of your own eye. People love that. I mean, basically, you're saying you're probably a good guy, and I probably have a log in my eye. You have a speck. I'd like to help you get your speck out, but I actually can't see your speck because I have this stupid log in my eye. I mean, think of a log. Is it sticking out this way? Is it going this way across your face? I'm not sure how it works, but it's probably not good if you have a log in your eye. Get the log out of your eye first, and then I can help you with your speck. In other words, Jesus standing here, Jesus in our midst. He's loving you. He's got his arm around you. And he's pointing his finger at me and saying, Carl, you travel around the world talking about this stuff, and you don't even do it all yourself. You're a hypocrite. Who does he favor? Once again, probably you.